On the first morning of his new job, Colin Harper had a cup of coffee thrown directly at his chest by the woman he was supposed to be helping. She sat in a wheelchair behind a desk, large enough to seat 8 people, her eyes cold, her voice colder. She told him he had 5 minutes to disappear from her house and never come back. 37 assistants before him had quit before lunch, some crying in the hallway, one calling the police out of sheer confusion, none of them lasting long enough to learn her name properly. Evelyn Parker had once built an empire worth billions of dollars from nothing but stubbornness and a mind that never slowed down, and now she could not feel her own legs. She trusted no one anymore. Certain that everyone who walked through her door wanted her money or her name attached to their resume. But Colin did not walk out. He knelt down, wiped the spilled coffee from the marble floor with the sleeve of his own jacket, and said quietly that it was fine, that he still had plenty of time today to start over if he needed to. It was such a small sentence, spoken without anger or fear, but it would end up changing the direction of 2 lives that had both been quietly falling apart. Before any of that ever happened, before the wheelchair and the shattered nerves and the year of silence that followed, Evelyn Parker had been the kind of woman magazines like to photograph standing at the top of unfinished buildings, wearing a hard hat and an expensive coat, as though she alone had willed the steel frame into existence. People who worked under her respected her enormously and feared her almost as much because she remembered every promise anyone made to her and held them to it with a precision that left no room for excuses. She had grown up watching her father slowly mismanage the company her grandfather built, watching contracts slip away and factories close because he trusted the wrong people and second-guessed the right decisions, and she had promised herself as a teenager that she would never let sentiment cloud a business judgment the way his had. By the time she took control of Parker Industries in her late 20s, she had already spent years proving to a skeptical board that competence did not have an age requirement, and once she had the company in her hands, she ran it the way she ran her own body, pushing past every limit anyone tried to place on her. Evelyn Parker was 32 years old when the accident happened, though by then she had already spent a decade proving people wrong. She had become the youngest chief executive in the history of Parker Industries, a company her grandfather had founded and her father had nearly destroyed, and she had rebuilt it with a kind of relentless, almost frightening determination. She ran marathons before board meetings. She drove herself to construction sites in the middle of the night just to check that contractors were not cutting corners. She worked 16 hours a day and expected everyone around her to keep pace, and most people simply could not. She was demanding, sharp-tongued, impossible to satisfy, but undeniably brilliant, the kind of woman whose name alone could move markets. Then, on a rainy evening a little over a year before Colin ever knocked on her door, a truck ran a red light and struck her car on the driver's side. She remembered very little of the impact itself, only the sound, and then waking up in a hospital room with tubes running into her arms, and a doctor standing at the foot of her bed with an expression she would never forget. The spinal cord injury was severe. The doctor told her, as gently as such news could be told, that she would not walk again. It was not only her legs that stopped working that night. It felt, to Evelyn, as though everything she had built her identity around had been taken at once. She had always measured her worth in motion, in speed, in the ability to outwork and outthink everyone in the room, and suddenly she could not even transfer herself from a bed to a chair without help. The humiliation of that dependency cut deeper than any physical pain. In the months that followed, she withdrew from almost everyone. She refused to see old friends, convinced they only wanted to witness her decline out of morbid curiosity. She avoided the press entirely, letting her chief operating officer speak on her behalf, while rumors swirled about her health and her competence. She rarely left her mansion, and when she did, it was only for medical appointments she could not avoid. Inside those walls, assistants and caregivers rotated through so quickly that the household staff joked darkly about starting a betting pool on how long each new hire would survive. The 38th one had walked out that very morning, before Colin arrived, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Evelyn had simply laughed, a short, bitter sound, and murmured to no one in particular that it was exactly what she had expected. Before he ever set foot inside the Parker estate, Colin's days had taken on a grim, repetitive shape built entirely around keeping his daughter fed, clothed, and unaware of just how close to the edge they were living. He woke before dawn most mornings to catch the early shift at whatever job he currently held, dropped Emma at a neighbor's apartment on his way out, and spent his commute mentally rearranging bills in his head, deciding which ones could wait another week and which ones could not. He was not a man given to self-pity, largely because he had watched his own father drown in it after losing a factory job decades earlier, and he had promised himself as a young man that whatever hardship came his way, he would meet it with his hands rather than his complaints. Rachel used to tease him gently about this, calling him stubborn in the specific way that refused to ask anyone for help, even when help was clearly needed, and after she died, that same stubbornness became both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden, since there was no longer anyone at home who knew how to talk him out of carrying everything alone. Colin Harper was 38 years old and had been raising his daughter alone for nearly 3 years, ever since his wife Rachel had died after a long fight with cancer that drained not only their savings, but something deeper in him that he still had not fully recovered. He and his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place with a leaking faucet the landlord never quite got around to fixing, and a heater that worked only if you hit it in the right spot. Colin had worked a string of physical jobs since Rachel's death, loading trucks at a warehouse, doing odd electrical repairs for neighbors who paid in cash, delivering packages in a beat-up van that barely started in the winter. He had lost the warehouse job 2 weeks earlier when the company downsized, and the rent was already a month behind. Emma was supposed to start at a new school in the fall, one with a modest tuition fee that Colin had promised himself he would find a way to cover, though he had no idea how. He felt, most nights, like a man treading water in the dark with no shore in sight. It was an employment agency that called him about the position, describing it vaguely as an assistant and caregiver role for a private client, with a salary 4 times what he had been making at the warehouse. The recruiter was almost apologetic when she mentioned that the position had a certain reputation, that the previous candidates had not lasted, that the family was looking for someone with an unusual amount of patience. Colin did not hesitate. He was not chasing some fantasy of becoming indispensable to a powerful executive, and he certainly was not naive enough to think the job would be easy. He said yes because Emma needed new shoes for school, and because the refrigerator at home held little more than eggs and bread, and because a man in his position did not get to be picky about what kind of difficulty he was willing to face. That evening, Emma looked up from her homework at the kitchen table and asked him, in the plain, unguarded way that children ask things, whether he was going to take care of a sick person now. Colin thought about it for a moment before answering. He told her no, that he was simply going to help someone who was very, very tired, and that sometimes tired people needed someone patient enough to wait with them until they remembered how to rest. The first morning at the Parker estate began with a warning from the head housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Marguerite, who pulled Colin aside before he even reached the study door. She told him plainly not to react to anything, no matter how cruel it seemed, because reacting was exactly what Evelyn wanted. A way to prove that he, too, would crumble like all the others. Colin thanked her and walked in anyway. Evelyn tested him within minutes, demanding he change the water in her glass 3 times because it was either too cold or not cold enough, insisting he redo her coffee twice, rearranging her schedule on a whim just to watch him scramble to keep up with the changes. He adjusted each time without complaint, without visible frustration, simply doing what was asked and waiting for the next demand. When none of that broke him, she deliberately let a ceramic mug slip from her hand, sending hot coffee splashing across his shirt and sleeve. She watched him with something close to satisfaction, telling him that if he wanted to quit, the door was right there and no one would blame him. Colin looked down at his soaked shirt, then back at her, his expression calm in a way that seemed to unsettle her more than any protest could have. He said only that he would clean it up, and he did, kneeling on the floor with a rag from the kitchen while she watched in silence. There was no flicker of pity in his face, no performance of wounded feelings, no fear either, and that combination seemed to bother Evelyn more than outright anger would have. By midday, she had grown tired of the standoff and announced flatly that he was fired. effective immediately, and that he should collect whatever belongings he had brought and leave. Colin nodded slowly, gathered the folder of paperwork he had set on the side table, and asked, without any trace of sarcasm, whether he should still come back tomorrow in case she changed her mind. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, genuinely at a loss for words for what felt like the first time in over a year, and said nothing at all as he let himself out. Marguerite, watching the exchange from the doorway, later admitted to the other staff that she had never seen anyone absorb one of Evelyn's outbursts without either crumbling or fighting back. And she began, quietly, to wonder whether this particular hire might actually survive the week. Evelyn tested him again the following afternoon, this time refusing to speak to him at all for hours, communicating only through curt, handwritten notes left on her desk, as though daring him to complain about the absurdity of it. Colin simply followed each instruction as written, delivering documents, adjusting the thermostat, rescheduling a call, never once asking why she would not simply speak to him directly. When she finally broke the silence herself, late in the day, to snap at him for arranging her folders in the wrong order, he apologized calmly, corrected the folders, and asked whether she preferred them alphabetized or organized by date going forward. The mundane practicality of the question seemed to throw her off balance more than any of her own tactics had thrown him. He came back the next morning anyway, precisely on time, dressed neatly, carrying a folder of updated schedules he had prepared the night before at his kitchen table after Emma had gone to sleep. Days turned into a slow, uneven rhythm. Colin was never late, never visibly rattled, and he refused to treat Evelyn with the two extremes she had grown used to from other people, either exaggerated pity or barely concealed fear. Before meetings, he prepared her documents with meticulous care, cross-referencing figures late into the night, so that nothing would embarrass her in front of board members. Instead of asking how she was feeling, a question she had come to despise because it always sounded like a diagnosis, he asked her practical questions, whether she wanted the morning call to be a video conference or an in-person meeting, whether she preferred her notes printed or displayed on a tablet. Those small, ordinary questions did something unexpected inside her. They reminded her, for the first time in a long while, that she was still a chief executive making decisions, not merely a patient being managed. One afternoon, her wheelchair caught on the threshold of the study, one wheel jammed at an awkward angle against the frame, and Colin stepped forward but stopped himself before touching anything. He asked if he could help, and then, crucially, he waited for her answer, instead of simply acting. It was such a small gesture, yet it struck Evelyn with unexpected force. Because in the past year, so many people had grabbed at her chair, her arms, her body, without asking, as though her consent no longer mattered once she could no longer walk. She said yes, quietly, and he freed the wheel with careful, unhurried movements, then stepped back and waited for her to decide when to move forward. For the first time since the accident, Evelyn felt something close to being respected rather than merely handled. And the feeling lingered with her long after he had left the room that evening. It was through Emma that the second layer of understanding began to form. One weekend, Colin had no choice but to bring his daughter along. After his usual arrangement with a neighbor fell through, and Emma ended up sitting quietly in the sunroom with a book while her father finished some paperwork nearby. Evelyn, passing through on her way to the garden terrace, found herself drawn into conversation with the girl almost against her own will. Surprised by how easily Emma spoke, how unguarded she was in the way only children can be. At some point, without any prompting, Emma mentioned that her father used to cry sometimes after her mother died, quietly, at night, when he thought Emma was asleep, though she always knew. Evelyn went very still. It had not occurred to her, in all the weeks she had spent testing this man's patience, that he too carried a private grief heavy enough to bend a person in half. She had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that only she had suffered a loss worth counting. That evening, after Emma had gone home with a neighbor who offered to watch her while Colin finished his shift, Evelyn asked him directly what had happened to his wife. Colin did not flinch from the question, though he answered it plainly, without embellishment or self-pity. He told her that Rachel had been sick for nearly 2 years before she passed. that there had been a period after her death when he genuinely did not know how he was going to get out of bed each morning, let alone raise a daughter alone. He said that what had pulled him back from the edge of that despair was not some grand revelation, but simply Emma's face each morning, the small, unbearable fact that she needed him whether he felt capable or not. He did not deliver this as a lesson or a sermon meant to inspire her. He said it the way a person recounts something true and difficult. Without asking for sympathy in return, Evelyn sat in silence for a long time after he finished, longer than she had sat still in months, turning his words over in her mind, like something she had never considered from this angle before. The changes in Evelyn were slow enough that no single day marked a turn. She began finishing full meals instead of pushing food around her plate for a few minutes before declaring herself done. Her sleep, which had been shattered and shallow for months, grew steadier, though rarely easy. She agreed, after weeks of refusing outright, to meet with a rehabilitation specialist Colin had quietly researched and recommended, a woman with a reputation for working with patients who had given up on physical therapy entirely. The sessions were brutal. Evelyn's body screamed in protest at exercises that would have seemed laughably simple a year earlier, and there were afternoons when she wanted nothing more than to cancel the entire program and retreat back into her study. Colin never pushed her past what she said she could bear, and he never promised her false miracles about walking again someday. He simply told her, after each difficult session, that today had been a little better than yesterday, which was often true in ways too small to notice without someone paying close attention. There were setbacks scattered through those months as well. Days that refused to cooperate with the narrative of steady improvement. One evening, after a particularly grueling therapy session left her in more pain than usual, Evelyn snapped at Colin with the old cruelty, telling him he had no idea what it felt like to lose everything that once defined him, that his sympathy was cheap because he still had the use of his own body. Colin did not raise his voice in response, though something in his expression tightened for just a moment before he answered. He told her, quietly, that he understood loss did not need to look identical to be real, that watching Rachel disappear a little more each week for 2 years had taught him more about helplessness than he ever wanted to learn, and that comparing whose pain counted more was a game neither of them could win. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, and then closed it again, the fight draining out of her all at once, and she apologized later that night in a note left on his desk, short and awkward. The closest thing to vulnerability she had allowed herself to put in writing since the accident. Slowly, month by month, small victories accumulated into something larger. Evelyn learned to sit upright for longer stretches, without exhaustion pulling her under. She mastered transferring herself from the wheelchair to a car seat without assistance, a task that had once required 2 people and left her humiliated every time. She resumed video calls with department heads, her voice regaining some of its old sharpness, though tempered now by something that had not been there before the accident, a quieter kind of authority that did not need to shout to be heard. Eventually, she signed her first contract since the crash, a modest licensing deal that meant little financially but everything symbolically, because it proved to her, in ink and signature, that she was still capable of building things. Colin watched these milestones from the sidelines, never claiming credit, always redirecting the praise back toward her own effort whenever she tried to thank him for it. There were lighter days threaded through that stretch of recovery too, moments that had nothing to do with therapy or boardrooms at all. Emma, who had taken a liking to Evelyn's enormous, echoing kitchen, once talked her way into baking cookies there on a Saturday afternoon, while Colin finished some paperwork, and the two of them made such a mess of flour and spilled sugar across the counters that Marguerite pretended to be scandalized for a full minute before quietly joining in herself. Evelyn, drawn by the noise, wheeled herself in to find her pristine kitchen coated in a fine white dust, and a grinning 8-year-old holding out a slightly burnt cookie for her inspection, and, rather than the irritation everyone half expected, she simply took the cookie, declared it the finest thing she had eaten all year, and asked for another. On a different evening, Emma insisted on teaching Evelyn a card game she had learned at school, one with rules that seemed to change depending on how badly Emma was losing, and Evelyn, who had spent years dismantling far more complicated negotiating tactics in boardrooms across 3 continents, found herself thoroughly, and cheerfully outmaneuvered by a third grader. These small, unremarkable evenings did more to loosen the tightness in Evelyn's chest than any of the therapy sessions ever managed alone, reminding her that laughter had not, in fact, been permanently packed away with the rest of her old life. Just as Evelyn began to find solid ground beneath her again, a different kind of storm gathered on the horizon, one that had nothing to do with her spine and everything to do with the boardroom she had spent her whole adult life defending. Certain members of the board, men who had never liked answering to a woman half their age, even before the accident, began quietly campaigning to have her removed as chief executive, whispering to major shareholders that Parker Industries needed leadership that could, in their words, be fully present. Rumors spread through the financial press with unusual speed, fueled by an anonymous tip that included photographs of Evelyn during a difficult physical therapy session, images clearly taken without her knowledge or consent. The story painted her as fragile, diminished, no longer fit to steer a company worth billions, and for several days it seemed as though the narrative might take hold regardless of the truth behind it. Evelyn read the coverage alone in her study, late one night, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through article after article speculating about her capacity to lead, some outlets going so far as to suggest she should step down voluntarily before the board forced the issue. She felt the old despair rushing back in, faster and colder than she expected, the sense that no matter how hard she had fought to rebuild herself, the world would only ever see the wheelchair and nothing else. She told Colin, when he found her there past midnight, that perhaps it was simpler to resign quietly, to spare herself the public humiliation of a forced removal, to let someone else carry the weight she no longer trusted herself to carry. Colin listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her something she had not expected to hear from him. He said that the people spreading those photographs only saw a wheelchair, but he saw the woman who had built an entire company from almost nothing, who had fought her way back to sitting upright, to working full days, to laughing again on the rare occasions she allowed herself to. He said it plainly, without theatrics. And it was the first time in over a year that Evelyn Parker allowed herself to cry in front of another human being, not from despair this time, but from something closer to relief. What followed was not a miracle in the way people often imagine miracles, some sudden reversal that erased every difficulty in an instant. It was, instead, a woman deciding, deliberately and with enormous effort, to stand back up, using nothing but her own will. Since her legs were no longer available to her for that purpose, Evelyn requested an emergency session with the full board, and she attended it in person rather than by video call, wheeling herself into the conference room with a composure that startled several of the men who had been quietly plotting her removal for weeks. She spoke without notes for the first 20 minutes, laying out not only the company's financial position with total command of every figure, but also directly addressing the whispered doubts about her competence, refusing to let anyone else frame the conversation around pity or scandal. She answered every hostile question thrown at her, and there were many, without raising her voice, dismantling each objection with the same precision she had once used to negotiate multi-million-dollar acquisitions. The room, which had entered the meeting expecting a fragile woman ready to be pushed aside, left it having witnessed something closer to a reckoning. One board member in particular, a heavy-set man named Richard Kessler, who had sat on the board since Evelyn's father's tenure and had never fully accepted her authority even before the accident, pressed her hardest during that meeting, suggesting outright that the company would be better served by a leader who could travel freely to inspect facilities and meet investors in person without what he called complications. Evelyn let him finish his entire statement without interruption, and then she asked him, calmly, to name a single site visit or investor meeting in the past 6 months that had suffered because of her physical condition rather than his own reluctance to adapt the itinerary. Kessler could not name one, because there was none to name, and the silence that followed his failed attempt spoke louder than any rebuttal Evelyn could have delivered herself. By the end of the meeting, 2 of the board members who had originally sided with Kessler quietly withdrew their support for any leadership change, unwilling to attach their names to a campaign that had just been dismantled so thoroughly in open session. The financial press, which had been so quick to speculate about her decline, pivoted just as quickly once footage of her performance leaked to a few outlets, and within days, the tone of coverage shifted from pity towards something resembling awe. The company's stock, which had wobbled during the height of the rumors, recovered and then climbed past its previous levels within the month. Employees who had grown uncertain about the direction of the company under a leader they barely saw in person began speaking of her again with the old respect, some even with a new kind of admiration that had not existed before the accident, because now they had watched her fight for something in front of them rather than simply command from a position of assumed strength. In the quiet aftermath of that victory, Evelyn came to a realization that reshaped how she understood everything Colin had done for her over the preceding months. He had never once tried to rescue her from her circumstances. He had only ever insisted, patiently and consistently, that she was capable of rescuing herself, and that distinction, subtle as it seemed, had made all the difference in the world. It was around this time that Evelyn, without telling Colin, began quietly looking into the details of his life outside her household. Not out of suspicion, but out of a growing sense of debt she wanted to repay properly. She learned, through channels that required considerable discretion, that he still owed a significant balance on a bank loan he had taken out during Rachel's illness, one that had continued accruing interest long after her death, slowly strangling whatever savings Colin tried to build. She learned that Emma's placement at the new school he had promised her was genuinely at risk. The modest scholarship fund he had applied for, already stretched thin by dozens of other deserving families. Evelyn did not simply write a check and hand it to him, understanding instinctively that such a gesture, however well intended, might feel to a man like Colin less like generosity and more like charity, the very thing his pride had been quietly resisting for years. Instead, she worked with her legal and human resources teams to formalize his position at Parker Industries into something permanent and substantial, with a salary that reflected the actual weight of what he had been doing for months, alongside company housing that would ease the burden on his family, and a legitimate corporate scholarship program, one that had existed on paper for years but had rarely been used, which she now made certain covered every cent of Emma's tuition. Evelyn had spent an entire weekend drafting the language of the scholarship paperwork herself, rather than leaving it to her legal team, insisting on wording that made clear the funds came from a merit-based program open to any employee's child, rather than from her personal account, precisely so that Emma would never grow up believing she owed her education to charity, rather than to her own effort in earning it. She reviewed the numbers on Colin's outstanding loan 3 separate times before approving the restructuring her finance team proposed, wanting to be certain the new terms were something any employee in his position might reasonably qualify for, not a special exception carved out because of who he happened to be to her. It was, in its own way, as demanding a project as any acquisition she had ever overseen, though the stakes felt entirely different, measured not in quarterly earnings, but in whether a tired, proud man might be able to accept help without feeling as though his dignity had been quietly stripped away in the process. When Colin discovered the full scope of what had been arranged, quite by accident, through a conversation with a human resources officer who assumed he already knew, his first instinct was to refuse it outright, to tell Evelyn that he had not taken this job looking for rescue any more than she had wanted to be rescued herself. He found her in the garden that evening and said as much, his voice tight with a pride he rarely let show. Evelyn listened to him without interrupting, and when he finished, she reminded him, gently but firmly, that he had spent months teaching her that dignity mattered more than comfort, that a person deserved to be treated as capable rather than as an object of pity. She told him that everything she had arranged was earned, not given, that his salary reflected work he had already done, that the scholarship existed for exactly the kind of family Emma belonged to, that none of it required him to accept charity because none of it was charity to begin with. She said that he had helped her hold on to her own dignity during the hardest year of her life, and that this, in whatever small way she could manage, was her attempt to help him hold on to his. Colin stood there for a long moment. And then, for the first time since Rachel's death, he allowed himself to accept something without immediately calculating what it would cost his pride to receive it. In the weeks following the board meeting, Evelyn made a point of visiting several of the company's regional offices in person, something she had avoided doing since the accident out of a reluctance to be seen struggling with airports and unfamiliar buildings. Colin arranged every detail of those trips, with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything else, scouting accessible routes ahead of time, coordinating with local staff, so that no one would be caught off guard. Worse, overly solicitous in a way that made her feel like a spectacle rather than a leader. At one manufacturing site in particular, a floor supervisor who had worked for Parker Industries for nearly 20 years approached Evelyn directly after her tour, visibly nervous, and told her that watching her walk the factory floor in her wheelchair, asking sharp questions about production numbers exactly as she always had, meant more to him than she probably realized, because his own brother had been paralyzed in a workplace accident years earlier and had struggled since then to find anyone who still took him seriously. Evelyn thanked him, and later, in the car back to the airport, she was quiet for a long time before telling Colin that moments like that were beginning to matter to her almost as much as the company's balance sheet ever had. A year passed, and Parker Industries not only recovered from the turbulence of that difficult season, but grew stronger than it had been even before the accident, expanding into new markets that Evelyn oversaw, with a clarity and confidence that seemed, if anything, sharper than before. She remained in her wheelchair, and she had long since stopped waiting for some future date when that would change, choosing instead to build a life of genuine purpose around the body she actually had, rather than the one she used to imagine returning to. She began accepting invitations to speak publicly, something she would have refused without hesitation a year earlier, standing before audiences of thousands to talk about leadership after adversity, about the particular kind of strength required to keep building something when your own body no longer cooperates with your ambitions. Colin, meanwhile, had been promoted well beyond the vague title of assistant, now serving as her chief operating coordinator, a role that formalized what he had already been doing for months, managing logistics and personnel with the same steady competence he had once used to keep a warehouse floor running smoothly. Emma, older now and more confident, had become a familiar presence around the Parker Industries offices, often stopping by after school to do homework in the corner of Evelyn's office, while the two adults finished their work for the day. The three of them had settled, without anyone formally deciding it, into something that resembled family in every way that mattered except blood, sharing dinners, some evenings, celebrating small victories together, checking in on one another during the harder days that still came from time to time for both adults. One quiet afternoon, as autumn light slanted through the tall windows of Evelyn's office, she turned to Colin, who was reviewing a stack of reports at the corner table, and asked him something she had wondered about for a long time, but never quite found the right moment to voice. She asked why, on that very first morning, with coffee soaking through his shirt and every reasonable signal telling him to walk away, he had chosen to stay. Colin set down the papers he was holding and thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about most things that mattered to him. He told her it was because of something Emma had asked him the night before he started the job, a simple question from an 8-year-old that had stayed with him ever since. She had asked him whether he was going to take care of a sick person, and later, in a way that only children manage without meaning to be profound, she had wondered aloud what happened to someone who was suffering if everyone around them kept leaving. He repeated the question exactly as Emma had posed it, asking Evelyn who would be left to stay if everyone who encountered pain simply chose to walk away from it. Evelyn sat with that answer in complete silence for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind her eyes, the weight of an entire year settling into a shape she could finally recognize and hold. The company held its annual anniversary gathering that winter, an event Evelyn had avoided the previous 2 years, unwilling to stand before crowds of employees and shareholders, while still adjusting to the life the accident had forced upon her. This year she chose to attend in person, wheeling herself to the front of the ballroom where hundreds of employees had gathered. And she spoke without any prepared remarks handed to her by a communications team, choosing instead to speak from something closer to the center of her own experience. She told the room that people often assumed a chief executive needed brilliant strategists or fearless negotiators surrounding her at all times, and that for most of her career, She had believed exactly that herself. She said that what she had actually needed, in the year that nearly broke her beyond repair, was something far simpler and far rarer, a single person patient enough not to walk out the door on the very first morning when everything about the situation practically begged him to leave. The room rose to its feet before she had even finished speaking, applause swelling through the ballroom in a way that startled her slightly. Unaccustomed, as she still was to receiving anything resembling public affection rather than public scrutiny. Colin stood near the back of the room, having deliberately avoided the front rows out of habit and modesty, and he found himself unexpectedly overcome, blinking hard against a tightness in his throat that he had not anticipated. Emma, who had come along for the evening in a dress she had picked out herself for the occasion, broke away from the small group of employees' children she had been talking with, and ran the length of the ballroom to wrap her arms around both her father and the woman she had come to think of, in all the ways that counted, as something like family. Neither adult tried very hard to hide how deeply moved they were in that moment, standing together amid a room full of strangers who had somehow become, through a year of small and difficult choices, something closer to witnesses of an unlikely rebuilding. There was no miracle cure waiting at the end of this story. No sudden recovery that returned feeling to legs that would never move the same way again. No overnight fortune that transformed Colin from a struggling single father into someone unrecognizable from who he had always been. Evelyn never walked out of that ballroom on her own 2 feet. And she stopped needing to prove her strength through that particular measure, a long time before the anniversary gathering ever took place. Colin did not become a wealthy man overnight either, though the stability his new position provided meant Emma slept in a warmer apartment that winter, and never had to wonder again whether her school tuition would be paid on time. What both of them found instead was something considerably harder to manufacture than money or mobility, a kind of trust neither had believed themselves capable of extending to another person again after everything life had already taken from each of them. Evelyn found her way back to believing that life still held purpose worth pursuing, even in a body that no longer obeyed her the way it once had, and that belief had not come from any doctor's prognosis or any physical breakthrough, but from watching one man refuse to treat her as broken simply because she could not stand on her own. Colin found something he had not realized he was searching for either, a measure of security for his daughter's future that felt earned rather than given, built through months of showing up when every reasonable instinct told him to walk away. And in the process, he had rediscovered a version of himself capable of more than survival. Both of them came to understand, in their own separate and quiet ways, that certain people enter a life not to save it outright, as though rescue were even possible from the outside, but to remind a person, patiently and without demanding anything in return, that they remain worthy of respect, worthy of love, and entirely capable of beginning again, no matter how far they believe they have fallen. Emma, for her part, had grown into the kind of teenager who treated the entire Parker Industries building as something between a second home and a personal kingdom, greeting the security guards by name and occasionally correcting junior analysts on points of arithmetic they had gotten wrong in their spreadsheets, much to their embarrassment and Evelyn's quiet amusement. She had taken to calling Evelyn by a nickname that made the older woman laugh every single time she heard it, a habit that softened even the most stressful afternoons in the office. On the evening of the anniversary gathering, after the applause had finally settled and the crowd had drifted toward the refreshment tables, Emma pulled Evelyn aside with the particular seriousness she reserved for important announcements, and told her that she had decided, when she grew up, that she wanted to run a company too, though she promised she would try to be slightly less terrifying to her first year of assistance than Evelyn had apparently been. Evelyn laughed harder than she had in months, the sound carrying across the ballroom, and told her that terrifying was a good place to start, but that the real secret, the one that mattered more than any strategy she could teach her, was learning who was worth keeping close once the terrifying part was over. Years later, when people asked Evelyn Parker what had truly changed the course of her recovery after the accident that nearly ended her career and very nearly ended something deeper inside her, she never mentioned the specialists or the physical therapy regimens or the eventual return of the company's stock price, though all of those things had mattered in their own way. She spoke instead of a morning she had once used to test the patience of a stranger, throwing a cup of coffee at a man's chest, expecting him to flee like all the others before him, and of the strange, quiet grace of watching him kneel down instead, to clean up the mess, without a trace of resentment on his face. She would say that she had spent 32 years believing strength meant never needing anyone, and that it had taken losing the use of her own legs to finally understand that the truest strength she ever demonstrated was allowing one steady, unremarkable, unshakable man to stay in the room long enough to help her remember who she still was underneath everything the accident had tried to take from her.